Hello and welcome to the Starting Admech series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces, also known as the Admech. For those new to the series, this is a series where we take a deep dive into a faction, beginning by looking at what to purchase first when starting out, then taking a deep dive into the special rules and different unit types within the faction, finally concluding by looking at different point army lists such as 500 points, 1,000 points, 2,000 points, that include a variety mix, ranging from budget lists to tournament lists and everything in between in that nature. And as such, it only makes sense to begin with what to purchase first when starting an Admech army, as that is a very commonly asked question. To start off with, I want to say that the Admech kits are very versatile in build, and most kits can build into multiple different things, giving you a lot of mileage, especially if you magnetize the different units that you purchase. On screen, I'll show an image that shows the different kits that can be built into multiple different unit types versus the kits that can only be built into one type of unit. However, some of those kits can also be built in such a way that the units within them are quite different because of the weapon loadouts that they come with. Now, this is very important to keep in mind because the Adeptus Mechanicus can be a rather expensive army, so being able to make use of your units in multiple different ways is very important because it gives you the ability to go from expensive units to less expensive units as you grow your collection, as well as trying out different things without breaking the bank. In terms of purchases, we're first going to look at the best value deals, which are usually the start collecting kits and the combat patrol boxes. And let's look at the combat patrol box and what you get inside of it. Each combat patrol box will cost you a total of $140 from the Games Workshop store if you're within the United States. And this box includes a Tech Priest Engine Seer, which will normally cost you $33 and has seen some improvement from his previous iteration within the army. After the Engine Seer, you get 10 Skitarii units, which will be the core of your army, and a box of 10 Skitarii costs about $44. After the Skitarii, you get a Dune Crawler, which will cost about $75, and it fits into your heavy support slot, being one of the better heavy support options that the Admech currently have due to the many different weapon loadouts that it can equip in terms of firepower. Finally, you get 3 Cataphron units that you can build as either breachers or destroyers, and those 3 Cataphrons would normally run you $58 if bought individually. This means that the total value of the Combat Patrol box is $210 if bought separately, giving you a savings of $70. There is one thing I would like to address that you might have heard before in the past, that being that the Cataphrons and the Skitarii don't necessarily mix very well when brought in the same army. However, with the 9th edition codex being introduced, it seems to be a lot more sensible to mix Cataphrons with Skitarii, and while this happened in the past, it wasn't very common and was more of a fringe thing to do, though now it seems like the Cataphrons are very good bulwark units that protect your Skitarii and act as a blockade against enemy forces, while large units of the Skitarii pack quite a punch. So don't look at this kit and dismiss it simply because you've heard in the past that Skitarii and Cataphrons don't necessarily mix together, as that might have changed, and now it's a lot more reasonable of a strategy than it used to be in the past. In contrast to the Combat Patrol, there is the Start Collecting box, which will come in at $95 USD from the Games Workshop store. And what does this box include? Well, it includes the same Engine Seer and the same 10 Skitarii as you would get within the Combat Patrol. However, instead of a Dune Crawler, it includes a Scorpius tank. The Scorpius tank has taken a bit of a hit within the 9th edition rules, as well as a transition from 8th edition to 9th edition, and it has gone down in rankings as such, meaning that the Scorpius Disintegrator is a little bit weaker than the Dune Crawler. Although keeping that in mind, the Scorpius can also build into a Dune Rider, which is a transport that is rather good and will see plenty of play within the upcoming edition in order to carry around different units across the battlefield for the Admech forces. This means that while the Scorpius isn't necessarily as strong as the Dune Crawler, it does give you a lot more versatility, and switching between the Dune Rider and the Disintegrator is rather easy even without magnetization, meaning that even the most inexperienced modeler should be able to accomplish this rather simply. So in some ways, the versatility does give you a lot more optionality going down that road, and is probably better for a new player as it gives you the ability to switch between the two. I should also mention that even though the Disintegrator does not necessarily come with the strongest weapons, it does have a unique weapon in the Admech forces that does ignore line of sight and is the only way to get access to such a weapon. And if bought individually, if we remember correctly, the Engine Seer is $33, the Skitarii were $44, and the Scorpius is the same price as the Dune Crawler at $75, meaning this box if bought individually would cost a total of $152, giving you a total of $57 in savings when comparing that cost to the $95 price tag. Something else to keep in mind is that if you buy a Start Collecting box and a box of Cataphrons, it'll cost you a total of $153, meaning that it's not that different from buying a Combat Patrol, although it is a little more expensive. Though keeping that in mind, don't forget you can also buy different units other than the Cataphrons in order to fill that space, so it does give you a little bit of a pick and choose alternative to building a 500-point army, although you might find yourself struggling to fill out those points for the same price by buying the Start Collecting and some other kits. Though that might be the case, it's still never bad to have those kind of different options. A couple of things to keep in mind about both these kits is that oftentimes if you go to an independent retailer, you can get these kits at a discount ranging anywhere from 15 to 20% off from the sticker price that you would buy them from the Games Workshop store, meaning that you can save yourself quite a bit of money across the span of an army. So do keep that in mind and don't necessarily default to the Games Workshop store, but rather consider supporting your local gaming stores and independent retailers who do offer such discounts. The other thing I would like to mention is that both these boxes do include 2 secret units potentially. The first secret unit being a techno-archaeologist formerly known as the Deolosis, and the second being a Skitarii Marshal. Where are these units located within these boxes? Well, the answer is that they're both rather easy to convert from regular Skitarii models or even the Engine Seer, if you do happen to buy a Combat Patrol and a Start Collecting box in order to fill out your Skitarii ranks. As such, you can get a lot of extra mileage by converting these 2 HQ choices instead of buying them if you're on a budget. More so, I should mention that the Scorpius does come with a couple of gunner units that don't have any bases of their own, so they're just additional fluff units that you'll see within the Scorpius Dune Rider manning the guns. You can actually use these bodies of the Skitarii if you buy a couple extra bases, meaning that the Scorpius model within the Start Collecting kit gives you a little bit extra mileage above and beyond that of the Combat Patrol when trying to convert these 2 characters, which is a nice little perk to gain when buying that box. So do keep all of that in mind, and do remember there are many different ways to save on costs when building an army, and that the Admech can be rather expensive at times, so anything to cut back on costs a little bit does help you out in that sense. Now let's say you've either purchased the Start Collecting box or the Combat Patrol, maybe you've purchased both and you want to buy some other units, or you simply don't want to buy either of those and would rather buy something different altogether. As such, let's take a look at some priority units that you can pick up early on to build out your army and you'll find use for within various lists you build in the future. Once again, I'd like to mention that most things are playable within the Admech forces, it's just that these units are exceptionally powerful and will give you a lot more mileage than other units to consider. The first of these units is the Bilastari Iron Striders, and the reason the Iron Striders are so good is because they're incredibly points efficient, they have very high output, and are just devastating units altogether. More so, the dollar to point ratio, meaning that the amount of points you get for a dollar spent isn't the worst either, though it's not particularly amazing for them. However, they are better than some other choices, so they definitely do well in that sense. Not only can you arm them with 2 different special weapons, but if you magnetize the arms correctly, you can swap them pretty easily between the Iron Striders and the Dragoons. The Dragoons, in contrast to the Iron Striders, are a melee choice that is rather devastating in their own right, charging into enemy units with their taser lances to create absolute havoc within melee combat once they reach it. And the great thing about this is it offers so much versatility to your lists, letting you swap between an incredibly powerful shooting unit and an incredibly powerful melee unit, meaning that regardless if you want to build a shooting list or a melee list, the Iron Strider can swap between the 2, though if you have to pick only one, the Iron Strider is definitely the more efficient choice. After the Iron Strider, another great kit to pick up is the Archaeopter Flyer unit, which can be built into 3 different modes. 2 of the modes are rather good, being the gunship or the bomber, and fulfill very different roles within the army. The Transvector, which is the transport mode, is not particularly great, and you should probably avoid it. However, it's incredibly easy to magnetize this model to swap between all 3 modes, meaning that you essentially get 2 very powerful units for your army that can easily swap roles and be very powerful in 2 of the different roles, while having a 3rd role that you can always experiment with if you're feeling adventurous. That being said, this is a rather expensive kit, however, it eats up quite a bit of points, so it does make up for it in that sense, meaning that you're getting a rather good points to dollar ratio, although once again not the best. However, it's rather good for what Admech can expect, and just like the Iron Strider, the Archaeopter will see high levels of play in multiple different lists and different builds. Both these units are very versatile in what kind of armies you place them within. Finally, for units that you should consider buying when you're first starting out are the Sicarians, which can be built into either Sicarian Infiltrators or Sicarian Ruststalkers. And seeing these guys on this list really makes me realize how much the times have changed. These guys were on the low end of 8th edition going into 9th edition, and you probably will hear in older videos that you should avoid buying these, mine included, when I made the original series. And at the time this was very true because they were a rather weak unit that had a little bit of utility, though was more of a fringe unit that you would see on a very rare occasion as opposed to something you would put into your army. However, as I mentioned before, times have drastically changed, and in the 9th edition codex, the Infiltrators and the Ruststalkers are rather powerful units in their own right, with low points cost, good mobility, solid output, and decent survivability that will most likely see a lot of play, considering they can do all of these things and still be an incredible nuisance to your opponent, coming with a slew of new special abilities and incredibly buffed stat lines. The one downside is that the Sicarians are much harder to magnetize than some of the larger units, but if you do happen to be able to magnetize all of their different weapons, because all of the different weapons will probably be good at one point or another, except for maybe the Cord Claw build on the Ruststalkers, as it's a rather weak option compared to their other weapon loadout. And if you find that you can only build Infiltrators or Ruststalkers, I would say at this time it seems like the Infiltrators are a little bit better than the Ruststalkers, though time will tell which one does take off, as both of them are rather powerful, and it's very exciting to see them at this level of the game because they were very amazing models. However, they never had particularly great rules up until now. Seeing as we've covered what you should buy, we should look at what you should avoid when starting out with the Admech forces. I want to make it very clear the units in this section aren't bad and can be rather good, it's just they're not optimal for people starting out for one reason or another that I will make clear as we cover each of the units listed here. That being said, if you like any of these units, don't be afraid to pick them up and play with them, as you'll probably find a use for them. It's just that the units mentioned previously are units that will fit into more lists and have the ability to swap their role within any given army with simple magnetization, giving them a lot more mileage and switch up playstyles rather easily depending on how you evolve as a player as you continue playing games and determine what kind of preferences you have when it comes to army types. Now, to begin the list of units you should probably avoid when starting out, we'll first look at the Castellan robots. They're definitely not bad, and if you want to fill out your points quickly, they do a great job of that. The issue with the Castellan robots is that they are a rather expensive unit, and a unit of 2 of them with a data smith eats up more than 250 points, which is both a benefit and a detriment depending on how much you want to use up your points. Think about it this way: at 500 points, that's 50% of your army, and even at 1,000 points, that's more than 25% of your army, eaten up by 3 different models, most of those points going to 2 of those models. This brings us to another issue that we have, which is while they aren't exactly squishy units, they aren't the world's most durable units, meaning that in smaller games, when they are such a big chunk of your army, they can be focused down much more easily and really harm your ability to perform on the tabletop if they don't get their points worth before being destroyed. Considering how good things like Iron Striders are and other shooting units, they can easily take down a pair of Castellans before the Castellans can really shine, so generally it's better to wait till you have a large army to include them. Although that being said, they could also be a good way to increase your points very quickly if you're trying to get to 2,000 points as quickly as possible. One final note that I'll have on the Castellans is that they also aren't particularly versatile, because while that aspect was increased within the 9th edition codex by letting them mix and match their weapons, their points are still too high for what they offer in their shooting profile, and they aren't the fastest moving unit either. All that being said, if you build them in something like the Lucius Forge World with a Solar Flare relic, they can be a decently strong unit when comboed with some other stratagems and the Data Smith abilities, but that does go to show you how much you have to build around them, and keep in mind that Data Smith really isn't doing much besides buffing the Castellan robots. At the end of the day, if you don't mind them warping your list in such a way, they're a good bit of fun to have, and they can definitely be an interesting unit to play with. Just keep in mind that you're going to have to really build around them. Following the Castellan robots, the second unit you should avoid buying when you're first starting out is Belisarius Call. He's like the Castellans in many ways when it comes to this topic, in that his versatility has increased somewhat in the 9th edition codex, but he is still a bit restrictive and wants you to warp your list around him to some extent because of how many points he is and how he interacts with your other units. More so, speaking of points, unlike the Castellans, which can be a raw output unit, he's more of a buff unit, making him much weaker at lower point games than in higher point games. So when looking at his value of 180 points, if you want to include him in your 500 point army, 36% of those points will be used in order to just include him by himself, not counting any of the other units you wish to include. Keeping that in mind, he's not the most expensive character in the world when looking at other characters available to some armies, and he might find a home still in higher point army lists, especially around 2,000 points. So while he's not something you should necessarily go out and buy initially, he might be something you should consider once you've kind of determined what kind of playstyle you have, and if you're okay with building an army that focuses around Call and units such as Belisarius Call. Once you made that decision, he's definitely an interesting unit to include. Following the Castellans and Call, in third place, the box you really shouldn't buy is the Skitarii Warriors, which can build both into Rangers and Vanguard. The only reason I say this is because at $44, they're a little bit expensive, and considering you get 10 Rangers whenever you buy a Combat Patrol or Start Collecting box, you'll usually get plenty of Skitarii units from those 2 boxes. That being said, there will be situations in which you want additional Skitarii units, and if that happens to occur, don't be afraid to buy a box of these. It's just something you don't want to buy initially, considering you're going to get at least 10 of them when purchasing one of those discount boxes, and in many cases you'll probably purchase more than one of those discount boxes because a lot of times they have rather good synergy and rather good units with the Doomcrawler and the Scorpius. So there's a lot more reason to simply go for one of those if you can afford it and if it's available before buying one of the Skitarii boxes themselves. Although once again, if you need additional Skitarii and you don't really care about either of the heavy support options, just pick up a box of Skitarii and don't feel too bad about it. If sometimes it's not available, that's also another reason to buy the Skitarii while you have them as an option. And finally, after those 3 picks, the last choice you shouldn't buy when you're first starting out is the Cerberus Raiders. news, and this may surprise many different people because the Cerberus Raiders are very good and have rather good rules as well as very low points values for what they bring to the table, much like they were before when they were introduced in Engine War. So why are these units on the list of units to avoid considering how good they are? Well, the answer is for budget reasons when it comes to new players, as a box of 3 of these cost a total of $60 and will only use up a total of 48 points in an army list, meaning that if you buy 2 boxes of Cerberus Raiders for a total of $120, the models you'll get will add up to a total of 96 points, whereas for another $20 you can buy a Combat Patrol box and get yourself what's roughly a 500 point army. It's interesting to note that a lot of the criticism I have for units you should avoid are units that are generally either too high or too low in points for how much they cost. You'll probably want to get some Raiders eventually, but if you're a new player on a budget, consider other options at first, or at the very least be willing to run them as Cerberus Sulphur Hounds, who build out of the same box as the Cerberus Raiders and aren't bad units by any means, but do use up a bit more points. You can either magnetize them or simply proxy the Raiders as Sulphur Hounds until you get more points and models and switch them back to the Cerberus Raiders, once again showing that there's a lot of benefit to the kits we have, as a lot of the kits have an expensive point build as well as a low cost one, giving you a lot of versatility. While we're also on the topic of budget, I should give an honorable mention to the Skitarii Marshal and the Techno Archaeologist, both of which are cool models, but as mentioned previously can be converted from the basic Skitarii bodies and different bits that come within the Skitarii boxes. If you like the models and you're not necessarily worried about your budget, they're rather good, and I bought a Marshal myself, but if budget is an issue, it's best to convert them from regular models and save yourself a little bit of money to invest into other units until you can afford these models if you so desire. Now that we've covered the best budget options, the units that are best to purchase early on, and the units you should probably avoid until later, we should wrap up with 2 items that you should avoid purchasing to the point where you should only purchase them in extreme cases. The first of these is the Warzone Caradon book, also known as the First Book of Rust. This is a supplement to our codex and includes additional special rules for the Metallica Forge World, as well as the rules for the Army of Renown, known as the Defense Cohort. All of the rules for these 2 special armies are rather reasonable rules, but those rules take up all of 4 pages within a $60 book. If you like collecting codexes and don't mind spending the money, it's a fun purchase, but otherwise there are easier ways to enjoy what it has to offer, and many people who purchase these supplements are oftentimes disappointed by the amount of content they get for what they're looking for. That being said, don't discount the Metallica Forge rules found within this book. It's just that maybe you should find a way to share this book or split the cost among friends who play the different armies that are listed within the supplement. The second item you should avoid in almost every single case is another supplement book known as the Engine War book, which shows up in the Games Workshop online store at this time, and that's a bit concerning when you're considering rather new players who might not understand what they should be purchasing. The reason for this concern is that this is an old supplement that is no longer for the Admech forces and has no use for Admech players who are not interested in any of the other factions that might still have valid rules within that supplement. This supplement book only serves for collection purposes and has absolutely no use at this point, as all of the rules in it for the Admech have been superseded within the 9th edition codex, so do keep that in mind and don't accidentally purchase the Engine War book thinking that it has any useful information for you as an Admech player. Though if you do play one of the other factions that still has valid rules within that supplement, it might be something that you would be interested in picking up. And finally, before we conclude this episode in the series, I would like to say that if I didn't mention a unit, that means that the unit is a maybe purchase and is probably decent enough, falling somewhere between the power units that you want to pick up early and the units that you want to avoid, though it also means there's probably not much that stands out about that unit that would really make me want to push into it. As a new player, you should probably get comfortable with a certain set of units before really expanding it into a myriad of different units, so it'd be probably best to first expand into Sicarians, and then once you feel comfortable with them, to expand to the Corpuscari or something of the other nature. So do keep that in mind as well when making purchases as a new player, that you want to kind of focus on a core of your army and first understand all of that before really branching out heavily, as it'll make it much easier for you to get a feel for how your forces work and how your army plays together. As while units might be powerful individually, they do work together as an army to form a cohesive force. Anyway, as always, if you've enjoyed the content, please remember to like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out. And if you know anyone who can benefit from this video or any of the other videos on my channel, please do share the content, as it can help other players out in terms of buying and building an army. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons for supporting the channel. Thank you very much, you guys are awesome people. One other thing I'll mention about the patrons is I've received a couple new patrons recently. If you're one of those new patrons and you don't see your name at the end screen there, I sent all my patrons a message on Patreon asking if it would be okay to put their name on there, because privacy is incredibly important to me. So if you would like to see your name on there and you're already a patron, please respond to that message, allow me to put your name up there, and it'll be up there within the next video. And regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time. Bye.